Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 121, Phase 3 Complete. Way back in Episode 51, I talked about the generation of Romans who grew up during the factional conflicts of Sulla and Marius, spent their middle years embroiled in the political wars of the First Triumvirate, and, if they managed to survive, they then died in old age, having just been dragged through 2 decades of civil war. It was a generation that knew nothing of the golden ages of Roman history that had come before them and would come after them. Theirs was a world where crass ambition and an indifference to the rule of law led to a series of compounding burdens that crippled them economically, morally, and spiritually. To wit, human life was cheap and everything else was expensive. The men and women born during the late Severan period could relate. Their entire adult lives had been given over to the crisis of the 3rd century. Now approaching old age, they could look back on a life that had been filled by nothing more than endless war, political instability, plague, famine, and economic depression. Theirs had been a hard road, as hard a road as had been endured by the generation that had witnessed the fall of the Republic. But that road was finally, mercifully, coming to an end, just in time for them to die. I suppose that of some generations much is asked. Not that anyone knew the hard road was coming to an end at the time. It would take a while before anyone realized that the Illyrian captain of the bodyguard who had just seized power was not just here to stay, but here to reshape, redefine, and restore an empire that had almost fallen apart completely. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight to help them clearly demark that before this point crisis, and after this point tetrarchy. We use arbitrary labels as a convenient way to help keep history straight in our heads, but we should never forget that they are just labels. To the Romans at the time, there was very little that would help them recognize that some corner had actually been turned when Diocletian came to power in 284. It was all just one long continuous evolution, and no one really had any reason to believe that the ascension of Diocletian would turn out later to be some epoch-defining moment. Most probably thought he would reign for a few years and then be killed off like all the rest. But history has a funny way of working itself out. Sometimes scrawny 19-year-olds of no consequence turn out to be Augustus, and sometimes relatively undistinguished soldier administrators turn out to be Diocletian. Who knows how these things work? But before we get to Diocletian, we have to pass through the last mini-dynasty of the crisis years and cover the reigns of Carus and his 2 sons, Carinus and Numerian. Marcus Aurelius Carus, or possibly Marcus Numerius Carus, had been born around 224 in Gaul, and was thus a card-carrying member of that generation that had known nothing but toil and trouble. Born into a family of senatorial rank, Carus was of course insulated from some of the more abject deprivations endured by his less wealthy contemporaries, but still, Romans of every rank and class had to face a world that was not at all their oyster anymore. Carus had been born in Gaul, but educated in Rome, planting him firmly on the side of the old Roman aristocracy. And whatever his role in the assassination of Probus, it probably felt good to wrestle power away from the rough Illyrian generals and return it to the hands of a senator who at least knew who Virgil was. His career is mostly obscure, but we know that he had not yet received the honor of a consulship, despite the fact that he was approaching 60, which means that he could not have ever been particularly close to the previous imperial inner circles. But he was regarded enough by Probus to be named Praetorian Prefect in early 282, so we can probably trust that he was a capable administrator and solid soldier. As with the other beneficiaries of imperial assassination during this period, it is hard to tell if Carus took an active part in the plot to kill Probus, or whether he simply took advantage of the opportunity that presented itself once the deed was done. And really, we don't even know if he was hailed as emperor before or after Probus was killed. So was he a Machiavellian usurper who engineered the death of a man who had just named him to one of the most important positions in the government? Or was he a diligent careerist who was well positioned to be swept along by history? We'll likely never know. All we do know is that the Senate didn't fight the choice made by the Sirmium garrison, and none of the generals out on the frontiers who might have challenged Carus chose to fight him, and so in late 282, he became emperor of the Roman Empire. After dutifully punishing the men who had murdered Probus, Carus followed the lead of just about every other emperor who had come to power with living sons, and elevated his two boys, Marcus Aurelius Carinus and Marcus Aurelius Numerius Numerianus, to the rank of Caesar, putting both in line to inherit the empire from their father. We don't have birth dates for either of Carus's sons, but if we figure they were sired when Carus was in his 20s, as would have been typical, then I think it's safe to say that they were both in their 30s at the time. Though in reading about them, you do get the distinct impression that they were younger than that, with Numerian in particular being depicted as a young man, perhaps even in his early 20s. So as not to belabor the point, I would say that the two new Caesars were neither children nor middle-aged men, and simply leave it at that. With a new Augustus in place and two grown sons ready to take over in case anything happened to him, there may have been hopes floating around that a new dynasty was in the making. A new dynasty that would bring some political stability to the empire. But alas, in less than 2 years, all three men would be dead, and the Romans would have to start all over again. Luckily, they would start all over again with Diocletian, who would bring political stability to the empire, so the demise of Carus and his sons didn't turn out to be the worst of all possible scenarios. Carus was the third Praetorian prefect to step into the purple, following in the footsteps of Macrinus and Philip the Arab. The former had been too bogged down by problems in the east to ever return to Rome, while the latter had made it a point to immediately return to the capital to solidify his position. Carus chose to split the difference. Remaining in Sirmium to keep would-be German raiders in check, and to finish preparations for the now twice aborted invasion of Persia, Carus sent his eldest son Carinus to Rome to represent the interests of the new imperial family. To help ensure that Carinus would be taken seriously, Carus decided to further elevate his oldest son to the rank of full Augustus, and charged Carinus with the task of ruling over the west, while he and Numerian focused on the east. With Carinus consolidating the family power in Rome, Carus and his younger son, Numerian, began a slow march to Syria, where they planned to launch the long-delayed attack on Sassanid Persia. As they passed through Moesia and Thrace, they fought a series of short engagements against hostile Quadi and Sarmatian raiders, engagements that were just significant enough for Carus to plausibly claim the title Germanicus Maximus. Carus and Numerian then passed through Asia Minor into Syria without incident, and in 283 they finally initiated the punitive expedition against the Persians that the Romans, well, at least the Roman High Command, had been seeking since the capture of Valerian now some 20 years past. And they could not have picked a better time. The Persian succession crisis that had arisen following the death of Shapur in the early 270s had been settled, but the heirs of the great king were weak and perpetually undercut by rival nobles, leaving the Sassanid Empire vulnerable to the Roman advance. On top of these internal divisions, Bahram II, one of Shapur's sons and the now reigning king, decided in the early 280s to look to the east rather than the west as the best direction for his empire to expand, and launched an invasion of what is now Afghanistan. With the bulk of his available forces tied down thousands of miles away in the mountains of Central Asia, Bahram had no way to counter Carus's invasion of Mesopotamia, and the Romans were essentially able to do whatever they wanted, inflict whatever damage they wanted, and claim whatever territory they wanted unopposed. Carus re-annexed Mesopotamia, occupied Seleucia and Ctesiphon, and then led his army across the Tigris without once facing significant opposition. Things could not have been going better for Carus, but of course, the gods were always a fickle bunch, and right at the moment of his greatest triumph, the emperor fell over dead in August 283. He was almost 60 years old and had ruled Rome for less than a year. There are, as usual, conflicting stories about his death. No one seems to believe that he was assassinated, though that is a possibility that can never fully be discounted. And instead, the sources say that he either died of a natural cause, like disease or heart attack, or, and this is where it gets good, he was struck dead by a bolt of lightning. The lightning story, of course, received the most airplay in the Roman world, as a freak accident like that, especially one involving a murderous thunderbolt from the sky, was immediately interpreted as a warning from the gods that Carus had strayed from the righteous path. Or, more specifically, he had strayed too far beyond the Tigris River, the long-established outer bounds of Roman territory. The alleged lightning strike was, in any event, the rationale most often pointed to when attempting to explain Numerian's decision to withdraw from Persia despite facing, well, nothing in the way of Persian resistance. Carus had pressed too far east and had been struck dead by lightning. The message could not have been more clear to the superstitious Romans. I would venture to guess, though, that Numerian's withdrawal was actually premised on the same logic that had led to so many Roman retreats from the eastern deserts. It was not worth the men or the resources that would have been necessary to hold the territory. And there was no telling whether the legions would be even able to hold the territory if and when the Persian armies decided to come down out of the mountains, which they would almost certainly be forced to do if the Romans continued to press their luck on the east side of the Tigris. So, following the death of his father, Numerian ordered the legions back to Syria. The campaign of Carus, while uniformly successful, didn't do much to soothe the still bruised Roman ego, and it wasn't until the victories of Galerius some 2 decades later that the Romans really exorcised the humiliation of Valerian's capture from their psyches. Unfortunately for Numerian, the gods were feeling extremely fickle these days, and despite his attempt to appease them by heading back home, he too would be dead after ruling for just over a year. The new emperor was apparently in good health as the legions passed through Emesa on what appeared to be the first leg of a long and leisurely trip back to the west to link up with his brother Carus, but by the time the army reached Asia Minor in November of 284, something was clearly amiss. The story going around was that Numerian had been stricken by some sort of inflammation of the eyes, and was unable to leave the dark, safe confines of his imperial litter. While the emperor was so stricken, orders were issued through his father-in-law, the Praetorian prefect Lucius Aper, a man who found his personal standing greatly enhanced by the death of one emperor and the sickness of another. So much so that his fellow officers began to grow suspicious. The story then goes that their suspicions were confirmed when the stench emanating from the imperial litter could no longer be covered up. The curtain of the litter was thrown open, and the rotting corpse of Numerian was revealed to everyone. That sneaky snake Aper had been issuing orders in the name of a dead man. Now, this whole story is, of course, preposterous on a number of different levels, but it's the story that Diocletian pushed once he was in charge of the history books, and so, for better or for worse, it is the story that has been handed down to us. Numerian's age was unknown, but he co-ruled the empire with his brother for just about a year. The story then continues that the general staff of the imperial army did not take too kindly to Aper's deception, and met in a closed council to decide, yes, the fate of that sneaky snake Praetorian prefect, but more importantly, to decide who ought to wear Numerian's now discarded purple robes. This was not a decision to be taken lightly, because there was, after all, a fully established Augustus sitting in Rome right at that very moment. Any decision the officers made other than recognizing the full authority of Carus would be treason and precipitate civil war. But the still Illyrian-heavy general staff looked at the veteran imperial army at their disposal and figured that now would be a pretty good opportunity to get one of their own back into power. The one of their own they settled on was something of a surprise pick, a career soldier by the name of Diocles. Unlike Claudius or Aurelian or Probus, Diocles had not been a man who had won fame leading the legions to victory in battle, and at the moment of his ascension, he personally controlled only a small number of troops. But what he lacked in grand military reputation, he more than made up for with his skill in the less showy but equally important game of backroom politics. That company of troops he commanded may have been small, but it just so happened to be the cavalry detachment that acted as the personal bodyguard of the emperor. Diocles may not have been a great general, but he had earned a spot in the emperor's inner circle, and carried with him the luster and authority of that association. Plus, over the course of his nearly 20-year-long career, a career about which we know almost nothing, by the way, Diocles had studiously cultivated relationships with every officer and soldier he came into contact with, and that network of allies was ready to spring into action when their friend, comrade, and benefactor decided to take the opportunity of Numerian's death to make a bid for power. The personal loyalty that Diocles inspired in the men he came into contact with was probably the single biggest factor in explaining his success as emperor, because only a man supremely confident in the continued loyalty of his subordinates could have even considered the kind of power-sharing agreement that the Emperor Diocletian would institute. And only a man who actually did inspire that kind of loyalty would be able to pull it off. As I just mentioned, we know almost nothing about the life and times of Diocles prior to his ascension. We don't even know his full name. He appears to have been born in 244 in Pannonia to lower-class parents, and his later detractors even went so far as to label him the son of a freedman. He would have joined the army sometime after the disaster of Valerian's capture, and thus would have spent the majority of his career as an officer serving under the auspices of his Illyrian countrymen, slowly rising up the ranks as that cabal of officers secured control of the military apparatus. He almost certainly commanded legions in Moesia, and the Historia Augusta records that he also served in Gaul, but modern scholars dismiss that whole episode as a fabrication that only served to put the future emperor in contact with a soothsayer who would helpfully prophesize that Diocles would attain great power after killing an ass, a prophecy that we will see fulfilled in just a minute. He apparently established a positive relationship with Carus at some point along the way, because when Carus became emperor, he not only named Diocles the captain of his personal bodyguard, but also awarded him with a consulship in 283. There is no telling what, if any, role Diocles played in the 3 imperial deaths that preceded his own rise to power. It could be that he played no part in any of them, played a part in some but not in others, or was in on every death from Probus to Numerian as a part of a long-term project to secure the throne for himself. Since he got to write the history books, though, tradition has it that Diocletian is innocent of all charges. His first act as emperor, in fact, was to declare publicly that he had had nothing to do with the death of Numerian, and that any and all blame lay squarely at the feet of the nefarious Aper. He made this announcement in front of an assembly of troops, with a bound Aper on his knees beside him. And in case you're wondering, yes, indeed, Aper is the Latin word for ass. Diocles then drew his sword and personally executed the prefect, fulfilling the alleged prophecy. Once Aper was dead, Diocles retired to his tent to plan his next move. First up on the docket was the small matter of creating a more, imperial persona for himself. The simple soldier Diocles thus announced that henceforth he was to be known as the far more regal Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, a name change that explains why we know him today as Diocletian. Once this was done, he had to turn his attention to the small matter of Carinus, the sitting Augustus back in Rome. This problem he set about solving by issuing proclamations that Carinus was actually a hated and debauched tyrant who maintained his position through fear and violence. It was thus Diocletian's responsibility and the responsibility of any Roman with a conscience, really, to march on Rome and depose the hated tyrant. Whether or not any of this was true is highly debatable, especially since, again, Diocletian had 20 years at his disposal to firmly cement the idea that he rose to power as a divinely appointed defender of Roman freedom, rather than as just another power-hungry general. Diocletian needed a villain, and Carus fit the bill. The villain in question, though, was not at all prepared to simply roll over for this upstart captain of the bodyguard. As soon as he learned that the men under his brother's command had decided to not simply transfer their loyalty to him, Carus gathered up his own army and marched east to meet the army marching west under the command of Diocletian. While passing through Pannonia, Carus apparently dealt with an uprising led by the local garrison commander and easily put the clamp down on any seditious activity. He then continued east with all deliberate speed, intent on preventing Diocletian from claiming any more territory than he already had de facto control of. The two armies finally met in Moesia in July of 285, and at the outset, it looked like Carus was going to put down Diocletian's insurrection as easily as he had put down the one in Pannonia. In a series of short engagements, Carus repeatedly got the better of Diocletian's men, and up until the decisive battle of the Margus River, it looked like Diocletian, whatever his political skills, was about to get thoroughly outgeneraled. But then Carus was betrayed, and everything fell apart. The first explanation we have for Carus's fall is that Diocletian had used those amazing political skills of his to induce Carus's army to defect just prior to the battle. Backing this theory is the fact that Carus's Praetorian prefect, the man who would have been most able to induce a defection of that magnitude, was kept on in his post after Carus's fall, and you have to figure that he did something to secure that kind of treatment. The other, more salacious story is that a tribune who harbored a personal grudge against the emperor because Carus had seduced his wife assassinated him just as Diocletian's army was about to be defeated, instantly turning the tide of the whole battle. Remember when I said that the death of Victorinus sounded like maybe it was made up because the whole jilted underling trope was a common one in ancient literature? Well, here's another example of that. One way or the other, though, at the end of the day, Carus was dead, and Diocletian stood tall as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. As with his brother, we really don't know how old Carus was when he died, but he had been Augustus for just about 2 years. His death, for all intents and purposes, marked the end of the crisis of the 3rd century. But as I mentioned earlier, no one knew it at the time. Diocletian was, at that point, just another usurper, and frankly, they were a dime a dozen these days. Next week, though, the Roman world will begin to realize that in Diocletian they were dealing with something else entirely. From the very beginning, his reign would prove to be a radical departure from what had come before him, and by the time he was done, almost every part of the Roman order, political, economic, social, military, would be transformed by the novel new policies of Diocletian. Ironically, though, Diocletian transformed the Roman Empire not because he wanted to build something new, but because he wanted to restore something old. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 122, Jupiter and Hercules. I think it's fair to say that for the last 50-odd years, the Roman Empire had been flying by the seat of its pants. Emperors would appear on the scene, run around madly trying to deal with whatever that week's crisis was, and then pass the baton off to the next man, who would run around madly trying to deal with the next week's crisis before passing the baton off to the next man, and so on and so on. Improvisation was the order of the day, and if anyone even had a long-term strategy, they usually had neither the time nor the resources to put it into action. Most of the emperors who ruled during the 3rd century had no idea that they would even be emperor a year before they found themselves draped in the purple. Sometimes not even the day before. So it's not like these men were bringing with them carefully laid out plans when they took over power. But by all accounts, Diocletian was different. He had been thinking about it. He had thought long and hard about the problems facing the empire and what he would do if he had the chance to solve them. This is not to say that Diocletian was immune from the twists and turns of fate, and he was forced to improvise with the best of them, but he at least had some broad notions about the direction the empire needed to go in, and he did his level best to keep the empire going that way. And after defeating Carus in 285 AD, he wasted no time getting going. Right away, Diocletian set the tone for the kind of administration he planned to lead. Elites across the empire always viewed transitions of power as incredibly dangerous periods of time. Who knew what kind of purges the new emperor would initiate as he set about consolidating his power? But right from the get-go, Diocletian made it clear that clemency would be his watchword. Not only were there no executions or banishments for Carus' allies, Diocletian actually kept on most of the previous regime's magistrates. But just as the relief was taking hold, the elites in Rome couldn't help but miss the other big signal Diocletian sent them. He would not be coming to the capital anytime soon. Diocletian had no interest in acknowledging even the symbolic power of the Senate, and though the frontiers were mostly quiet, and he could have made the trip easily, one of the things he had been thinking a lot about was that Rome needed to be removed from the political equation. The snubbing of the ancient capital was deliberate and permanent, and part of Diocletian's long-term project to wrest imperial legitimacy on something other than the consent of the long irrelevant Senate. The other big idea that Diocletian had firmly in the front of his mind when he came to power was that the job of emperor was now, without a doubt, too big a job for one man. At its core, the problem lay in the tension between external and internal threats. In order to ensure his place on the throne, an emperor has to keep with him at all times the largest and strongest army around. That way, ambitious generals elsewhere would not be able to muster any serious threats. But that meant that any significant external invasion had to be met personally by the emperor, since he was the only one with an army big enough to face it down. That meant a lot of running around for the emperor and a lot of borderland left unguarded as he ran from here to there. It also meant that these invasions were not being met in anything even resembling a timely manner. Diocletian had thought about this seemingly intractable problem, and finally came to the conclusion that there just had to be two emperors. Now, this was not a novel idea, but previous examples of it had arisen out of dynastic concerns, going back to the partnership of Augustus and Agrippa that was initiated most of all because Augustus had almost died without there being a capable heir in place. Fathers and sons would rule together, or brothers would rule together to cement a family dynasty, but never before had the idea of co-rulers been premised on the simple notion that more than one emperor was actually needed. And these days, Diocletian recognized that more than one ruler was needed. The basic logic of this solution was simple. Two emperors operating over different spheres would each be able to respond to problems in their territories far quicker and more efficiently than any one emperor would ever be able to do. It would also, by splitting the load of administrative paperwork, create a far more efficient bureaucracy to deal with all the minutiae of governance. Some questions can only be answered by emperors, and with two emperors, twice as much can be answered twice as fast. Finally, and this is where the whole thing could unravel, Diocletian bet that by investing a colleague with imperial authority, that command of the huge array of armed forces that would come with that promotion, a huge array of armed forces that were needed to keep the empire safe, that would not go to said colleague's head. They would already have all the dignity and power of an emperor, so no reason to rise up in revolt after winning some victory out on the frontiers. Right? The question then became, who in the world could be trusted with such a promotion? Diocletian needed another imperial army out in the field, and he needed someone capable of leading it. And since he had no son of his own, he needed someone from outside his family whose loyalty he could absolutely count on. Enter Maximian. The man who would become known as Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maximianus was born around 250 AD near Sirmium into a family of shopkeepers. He was 5 or 6 years younger than Diocletian, which meant that they were just close enough in age to have essentially risen through the ranks together, but just far enough apart in age for Diocletian to always be the senior partner. As with most of the Illyrian generals, the bulk of Maximian's early career is obscure, but it is almost certain that he was leading troops during Carus's eastern campaign, and highly likely that he was on hand for the drama of Numerian's death and the decision to elevate Diocletian. Depending on how far in advance Diocletian had been making his plans, it is entirely possible that he had been cultivating a friendship with Maximian for years, with the idea of appointing his junior colleague to share the purple with him if he ever got the chance to become emperor. Maximian was a good general, a stern disciplinarian, and a competent administrator. All of these traits recommended him to Diocletian, but perhaps more important than what Maximian brought with him to the table was what he didn't. Maximian had no native political talents to speak of. Elevating another man with a political mind might cause the new imperial partnership to devolve into mutual scheming, backbiting, and then, inevitably, civil war. But by choosing a blunt soldier who had no time for political machinations, Diocletian could be assured that he would have a partner in power, not a rival for power. The rapidity with which Maximian was promoted following Diocletian's elevation means that most likely all of this had been prearranged. Whether it had been arranged years in advance, or whether it was the final carrot used to secure Maximian's support following Numerian's death, is unknown. But we do know that immediately after the death of Carus in July of 285, that the imperial entourage traveled to Milan, where, in a solemn ceremony, Maximian was elevated to the rank of Caesar, and formally adopted by Diocletian. The empire now had 2 capable men of imperial rank to watch over its domains. And it was a good thing that it did, because there was no time to sit around basking in the glow of newfound imperial luxury. There were things to be done. Diocletian had already determined that he was going to leave the new Caesar Maximian to handle the West, and in particular the troubled province of Gaul, while he himself traveled east so he could secure the Danube frontier and be ready for any fallout from Carus's previous invasion of Persia. Making his capital in the city of Nicomedia in Asia Minor, essentially for the same strategic reasons Constantine chose to build his capital in Byzantium, Diocletian settled a brief war with the Sarmatians before taking a tour of the eastern provinces to ensure that the new administration would not have to deal with any problems from seditious-minded locals. It had, after all, been only a decade since the eastern Mediterranean had nearly become its own political entity. For all of 286, Diocletian put his stamp on the east, and back in Nicomedia in 287, he received the good news that far from looking for revenge, the Sassanid king Bahram II was looking for peace. The Persian king sent an embassy to Diocletian with gifts and promises of a stable border between the 2 great empires. Delighted that he might be able to solve the Persian question diplomatically, Diocletian jumped at the overtures, and after some haggling, the 2 sides agreed to swap some territory in order to rationalize the border, and then pledged mutual friendship and eternal peace. It didn't turn out to be exactly eternal peace, but at that moment, with so much else to deal with, the promise of even a temporary peace on the Eastern Front was music to Diocletian's ears. Unfortunately, the reason there was so much else to deal with was because despite getting off to a good start, Maximian had run into some serious difficulties in the West. As I just mentioned, Diocletian was not omnipotent, and he was forced to improvise his plans on the fly. The first test of his ability to make it up as he went along came early in 286, when frantic reports came pouring in that a general named Carus had broken free of Maximian's control and had proclaimed himself Augustus of Britain and northern Gaul. Well, hell. To go back a bit, after being named Caesar, Maximian had traveled north to Gaul, where he set up a capital in Mainz. His first major test came against a collection of peasants and ex-soldiers called, and I know I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, the Bagauti. We have very little understanding of the group, and no one really knows whether they were a real revolutionary force or whether they were just opportunistic brigands. But they had been running rampant throughout central Gaul for years and had to be stopped. Maximian, with the authority and resources of an emperor, was able to easily divide and conquer the gangs. But with Roman attention focused on the interior, tribes of Alemanni and Burgundians took advantage of the situation and began raiding into the empire. Compounding this threat along the Upper Rhine was the new threat of Frankish and Saxon pirates, who were based around the Lower Rhine. As Maximian dealt with the Alemanni and the Burgundians, he delegated the piracy issue to a highly capable general named Carus, who was not only a native of northern Gaul, but also an experienced naval captain. At first, everything went great. Maximian pushed back the Germans in the south, while Carus ran circles around the overmatched pirates in the north. But then troubling reports began to filter down to Maximian. Rather than returning the captured loot to its rightful owners, or at the very least collecting it in some public treasury, he was siphoning it off into his own private stashes. And worse than that, it was being reported that Carus was waiting for the pirates to finish plundering before he made any move to intercept them, so as to maximize his own profit. Now, a little pocket lining is one thing, but this breach of faith, actually standing by and allowing pirates to plunder and burn, was something else entirely. Maximian may have been a rough soldier, but a sense of honor pervaded his commitment to the empire. The legions were there to defend, not to exploit. Carus, whatever his merits, had gone too far. And this is where his lack of political savvy doomed Maximian. Rather than laying some careful trap for his wayward admiral, rather than coaxing him out of his stronghold with flattery and promises of friendship, Maximian simply demanded Carus report at once to account for himself. Understandably nervous about what might happen if he complied, Carus hesitated, which caused Maximian to declare him a public enemy and order his execution. This, of course, immediately negated any possibility of a peaceful end to the situation. Carus had at his disposal the entire Roman fleet, as well as the massive pile of loot he had spent the last few months accumulating. If Maximian wanted him, he could try to come get him, but good luck with that. Carus withdrew to Britain, where, with the help of his ill-gotten gains, he secured the loyalty of the legions stationed there. At the same time, everyone suddenly became aware of the back-channel talks Carus had been engaged in with the Franks this whole time. When the split with Maximian became official, the Franks seized most of the Gallic coast, and in particular the port of Boulogne. With the help of his new German allies, Carus now controlled an impregnable little kingdom. Even if Maximian were able to drive off the Franks, the Caesar had no fleet and no way of even reaching Britain, let alone fighting for it. And even then, getting bogged down in the north threatened the peace everywhere else. Reluctantly, Maximian allowed Carus to hold his little kingdom. This sudden rebellion forced Diocletian's hand. Up to this point, the relationship between Diocletian and Maximian had been one of Augustus and Caesar, father and son. But with Carus declaring himself Augustus, Diocletian had to match the bet on the table. It wouldn't do from a public relations standpoint to have an Augustus, self-proclaimed or otherwise, being met by a mere Caesar. The optics of it were all wrong. So in April 286, he further elevated Maximian to the rank of Augustus, and henceforth their relationship was one of brothers rather than that of father and son. Though he had botched the handling of Carus, Diocletian still had faith in Maximian, and Maximian, for now, continued to prove his worth. He may have been politically inept, but as a soldier he was second to none. Refusing to launch a rash campaign to retake Britain, Maximian kept his focus on southern and central Gaul, campaigning on both sides of the river to completely pacify the region before allowing himself to turn to the north. Not that preparations weren't underway. A fleet was even then being constructed for the eventual invasion of Britain, but Maximian wanted to make damn sure that his back was covered before he went north. Plus, Carus' rebellion had led him naturally into alliance with the German tribes. By launching a scorched earth campaign in Germany, Maximian hoped to devastate all of Carus' allies, leaving the treasonous general isolated on his island without mainland support. All through 286 and 287, while Diocletian was settling things diplomatically in the east, Maximian was settling things with the sword in the west. In the spring of 288, however, Diocletian felt confident enough in the stability of the eastern provinces that he decided to come to Gaul himself and aid his brother emperor. The breakaway of Carus was without a doubt the single most important thing going on in the empire at that moment. The prestige of the new administration was on the line, and Diocletian wanted to make sure that nothing was left to chance. The senior Augustus had his sights set on completely redefining the imperial order, with the express aim of denying future ambitious generals access to the kind of legitimacy they would need to usurp the throne, and, as you can imagine, the existence of a usurper in Britain was seriously upsetting Diocletian's plans. And to explain what I mean by denying access to legitimacy, we have to go back in time a bit. When he was reorganizing the state, Augustus used the Senate's long-standing and unrivaled authority to convey legitimacy onto his new regime. After 2.5 centuries, though, the Augustan system had finally cracked, and legitimacy was now conferred not by the Senate, but by the troops in the field. You could say that this had always been the case, but it was never so nakedly apparent to the soldiers themselves as it was during the crisis years. They used their new power with reckless abandon, and emperors were made and unmade at the drop of a hat. Diocletian had thought about how to wrest this power away from the soldiers, and he thought that he had hit upon a solution. Rather than looking down to the legions or over to the Senate for their legitimacy, emperors should henceforth look up to the heavens. This was a hugely important step in the history of political theory in the West, as it was here in the late 280s AD that Diocletian laid the foundation for 1,500 years of divinely appointed kings ruling over Europe. The fascinating thing about all of this is that this foundation was laid because of the specific circumstances facing Diocletian. He needed to restore discipline to the troops and restore a sense of awe-inspiring majesty to the office of emperor in order to restore stability to the empire. In his biography of Diocletian, Stephen Williams makes the point that though their policies were miles apart, that at heart, Augustus and Diocletian were really the same kind of man. Both were acutely aware that they needed to find a way to restore order after years of chaos. Had their roles been reversed, it would not at all have been out of character for Diocletian to have used the institutions of the Republic to stabilize a new autocracy, nor would it have been out of character for Augustus to argue for divine right following the crisis of the 3rd century. Neither man was an ideologue. They were pragmatists, more than willing to follow whichever course they thought would best achieve their ends. So it was not megalomania that led Diocletian to begin telling everyone that he was appointed by Jupiter, and nothing less than Jupiter's agent on Earth, just as it was not humility that led Augustus to tell everyone that he was merely the first citizen. It was rather, in both cases, a carefully thought-out piece of pageantry that each believed would halt the entropy that had afflicted their empire. It was in this way that the formal slide, and here is another one of those arbitrary labels we use to keep history straight in our heads, from principate to dominant, from the emperor styled as first citizen to the emperor styled as your lord and master. It was as he was finishing up his negotiations with the Persians in 287 that Diocletian first began to claim the divine authority that would become the foundation of his regime and the foundation of all future regimes. He took for himself the title Jovius and gave to Maximian the title Herculeus, references to the respective patron deities Diocletian had chosen for them, Jupiter and Hercules. The former, the head of the gods, the master architect, the supreme authority. The latter, the great hero, the indefatigable defender of mankind. And, this is where the supreme political artistry of Diocletian becomes apparent, the ever-ready tool of Jupiter. As Diocletian was setting up his new imperial paradigm, he made sure that it cemented the relationship he wished to have with his brother Emperor Maximian. Diocletian would be Jupiter, the architect of policy. Maximian would be Hercules, the hands that carried out those policies. It was a relationship that suited both men just fine. Maximian was no politician, and Diocletian was no general. Down the road, though, these new divinely inspired dynasties would run into problems. What if the new Jovius lacked vision? What if the new Hercules didn't want to take orders? But these were questions for another day. For now, Jupiter and Hercules would rule the united empire in harmony. Well, dang it, not fully united anymore. Hercules had gone and blundered away the island of Britain. Next week, Jupiter will travel to the west to help his faithful hero regain his footing. But it won't do much good. After running a joint campaign to put the final crackdown on any German troublemakers, Diocletian would leave the recovery of Britain in the hands of Maximian, but good old Hercules would botch the job again, and wind up leaving Carausius's position even stronger than it had been before. The upshot of the botched retaking of Britain was Diocletian's realization that 2 emperors were perhaps not enough. The British question wasn't going anywhere, but the empire couldn't afford to have Maximian forever bogged down on the Gallic coast. He was needed elsewhere. So next week, we will see another doubling of imperial authority, and for the first time in its long history, Rome would have 4 emperors working in concert with each other, a system that we have come to know as the Tetrarchy. Before we go this week, I want to mention 2 things for those of you out there who just can't get enough Mike Duncan in your lives. First, I did an interview last week with Andrew Johnston on his podcast Squared Show. So if you want to listen to me ramble on about various topics and say and sort of a lot, you can download Podcast Squared on iTunes or at the Lifestyle Pod Network. The URL for the direct download is a mouthful, so I'll just post a link at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. Second, in the more funsy category, I will be a guest on listener Matthew Johnson's local Austin radio show Remix on Wednesday, January 19 at 2 p.m. Central Time. What I get to do is bring in a mixtape of music and then talk with him about the relationship between work and writing and music, so it should be lots of fun. If you want to listen to the music that I listen to while writing the show, you can stream Co-op Radio online at www.koop.org. That too will get a link at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. So January 19 at 2 p.m. See you then. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 123, The Tetrarchy. I want to begin this week with a correction regarding the legend of Diocletian's ascension. As many of you have noted, the doomed Praetorian prefect Lucius Aper's name does not translate into English as ass at all, but instead as boar. And it's a good thing that it does, because when I went back and checked the supposed prophecy issued to young Diocletian, it actually says that he would gain the throne after killing a boar, not an ass, as I said. So the pun still works. I just wrote down the wrong animal name when I was working up the outline for that week's show. I feel doubly silly for making this mistake, since way back during the episodes on the First Punic War, I told you all the story of how Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio managed to earn the cognomen Asina after leading the Romans into their first naval battle, and consequently first naval defeat in 261 BC. Scipio the Ass, they called him. Why I thought that Aper should now also translate as ass is a mystery for the ages. I regret the error, and thanks to all of you out there who corrected the mistranslation, with an official hat tip to listener LB for being first on the scene. Last week, we covered the first few years of Diocletian's reign, and specifically his decision to elevate his colleague Maximian to the rank of Caesar in 285, and then to co-Augustus in 286. This week, we will see the Imperial College expand even further, as two more generals, Constantius and Galerius, will be invited to share in the purple in 293. This division of sovereignty at first proved to be an inspired move, and helped to ensure that Rome remained ascendant from Britain to Mesopotamia and everywhere in between. But eventually, the system will collapse when it comes time to hand off the so-called Tetrarchy to the next generation. But though it would not survive, the years of the Tetrarchy are amongst the most important in Roman history, and not just because they set the stage for the rise of Constantine the Great. Under the watchful eye of Diocletian and his colleagues, the Roman world will be transformed in ways both large and small to better meet the challenges that it now faced, all of which poses a bit of a problem for your humble podcaster. You see, this fragmentation of imperial authority leads to a fragmentation of the narrative, as now 4 separate centers of power are running 4 separate political and military apparatuses simultaneously. And when you couple this with the fact that along the way life as everyone knew it was being radically redefined, what you get is a big old mess. Say what you want about the drawbacks of Aurelian running around like a crazy person doing everything by himself, but at least it made for a coherent storyline. The 290s and early 300s AD, on the other hand, are a confused mess of war, politics, economic reform, and social reconstruction all happening all at once. So what I've decided to do is to try to run the chronological narrative up to the beginning of the Great Persecution of 303 AD, which will take maybe 2 full episodes. And then we'll double back and cover the reforms Diocletian made to the military structure, the governmental apparatus, and the economic system, all of which may require separate episodes unto themselves, though I haven't yet decided how exactly I'm going to break it down. We are in the process of establishing the ground rules for late antiquity, so I don't want to gloss over anything, but I also don't want to get so bogged down that we don't make any forward progress at all. Okay, are we ready? Here we go. In the spring of 288, Diocletian arrived in Gaul to meet with his brother Emperor Maximian and help lay the foundation for the eventual retaking of Britain and the Gallic coast from the usurper Carus. Without a fleet of their own, the two Augusti, for the moment, had to focus on pacifying the mainland so that when the inevitable invasion of Britain was launched, they would not have to worry about trouble from the Germanic tribes at their rear. For the rest of the year, they ran joint campaigns on the far side of the Rhine, with Maximian operating on the lower half of the river and Diocletian covering the upper half. It was a merciless scorched earth war that saw crops and livestock as much the target of legionary aggression as the tribesmen themselves, and by the end of the year, the exhausted and starved Germans were in no position to threaten Roman interests. Fortune was finally smiling on the Romans again, and the two Augusti even began the process of reoccupying portions of the Limes Germanicus that had been more or less abandoned some 20 years before. Satisfied with the hammer he had just laid on the Germans, Diocletian withdrew back to the east at the end of the year to keep an eye on the rest of the empire, while his colleague was busy with the British question. And in the spring of 289, Maximian was ready to answer that question. An invasion fleet had been under construction for some time, and now that the Germans were fairly well pacified, Maximian was able to use the Rhine Delta as his launching pad into the North Sea. Though the emperor had no choice but to attempt to retake Britain, from the very beginning he faced an uphill battle. Carus and his navy were experts at navigating the rough northern waters, and their experience stood in stark contrast to Maximian and his utterly green navy. On top of that, Carus had been hard at work fortifying the British coast, and in particular beefing up the so-called forts of the Saxon shore, a series of 9 fortresses, which though built at different periods, were very likely fused by Carus into a single unit of command at this point in history. What this all meant is that even if Maximian ran Carus's blockade, he would find no easy landing sites on the other side. But still, Maximian had to try, and so try he did. It is perhaps not surprising that all we know today about the invasion of 289 is that it failed. Emperors were not in the habit of dwelling on their defeats, so it is only by way of a few passing references that we even know the attempt was made at all, and these diplomatically blame the weather for Maximian's failure to retake Britain. And who knows, maybe it was the weather. It's not like the North Sea and the English Channel are the calmest bodies of water in the world, but it's just as likely that Maximian's inexperience on the seas made him easy pickings for Carus's expert fleet, and that it was man and not nature who drove the emperor back. Whoever it was, Maximian's fleet was destroyed, and Hercules was now further from recapturing Britain than he had ever been. As fast as the imperial post allowed, news reached Diocletian, who by that time had planted himself far in the east to help settle the new boundaries with Persia, and the no doubt severely disappointed emperor spent 290 AD making his way back to the west, very possibly forming in his mind the new order he would soon introduce to the world along the way. Beaten and battered, Maximian at this point seems to have taken at least some note of what could now only be described as his shaky political position. Whatever the long-term consequences of Diocletian's new argument of rule by divine right, at that time, at that moment, legitimacy was still based on one thing and one thing only: military victory. Perhaps sensing that his subordinate commanders were salivating, Maximian secured the loyalty of the best and most ambitious of them all by arranging for the man to divorce his wife and marry Maximian's daughter Theodora, thus securing a familial alliance that Maximian hoped would help keep him propped up in power while he, or more accurately Diocletian, figured out what to do next. The man in question was a fellow Illyrian general with a naturally pale complexion by the name of Constantius Chlorus. Constantius had been born around 250 AD in Illyria, so he was just about the same age as the man who was about to become his, quote, father. Though there is a whole tradition that has Constantius being the son of nobility, it is more likely that, like the rest of the Illyrian emperors, he was of low birth, and that his son Constantine went back and gave his father a more prestigious pedigree to bolster his own imperial claims. specifically linking the family to the Emperor Claudius Gothicus by way of Constantius's mother Claudia. Whatever his genealogical heritage, Constantius proved his worth as a soldier right away, and while still in his early 20s, he was promoted into the ranks of Aurelian's elite bodyguard. Right around this time, he also sired a child with his wife Helena, a son who would become known as Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantius, but who we know today as Constantine. Constantius, meanwhile, fought alongside Aurelian during the Palmyrene Wars, and then continued his climb up the ranks during the reigns of Probus and Carus, eventually finding himself governor of Dalmatia when the confrontation between Carinus and Diocletian exploded into open war, which meant that he was quite literally caught in the middle when the fighting began. But displaying some nimble prescience, Constantius declared for Diocletian right before the issue was decided, and it should be remembered, right before it was at all clear that Diocletian was going to win. And so he wound up squarely, but just barely, in the victor's camp in 285. When his term as governor was up, Constantius was promoted to the position of Praetorian Prefect in the west in 288, where he continued to distinguish himself during the campaigns on the east side of the Rhine in preparation for the invasion of Britain. We don't really know what role Constantius played in the failed invasion of Britain, though as prefect he had to have been neck-deep in the preparations, and later he showed very clearly that he had learned from the mistakes that were made in 289 when he initiated his own successful invasion. We also don't really know what long-term dynastic plans were at work when Maximian married his daughter to Constantius that same year. That is, did Constantius marry Theodora because Diocletian already planned to make him a Caesar, or was Constantius made Caesar because he was already married to Theodora? This question hinges on when Diocletian first conceived of the Tetrarchy, which is unfortunately a question we do not have a good answer to. However, we do have a good answer as to when Diocletian probably first broached the subject of further dividing the empire with Maximian, and that would be over the winter of 290-291. By that time, Diocletian had traveled all the way back to Milan to meet with Maximian and shore up the regime after its nasty setback in the north. The two emperors oversaw solemn ceremonies and exuberant games to celebrate their rule, the peace and stability of the empire, and their mutual support for one another. Whatever else you took away from the pageantry, there was no denying that despite the recent failures, Diocletian still stood behind Maximian 100%. Over the course of the winter and the following year, the two men met often, and Diocletian likely laid out his plans for the future and what he expected of Maximian, which is why some surmise that it was at this point that Diocletian revealed his plans to appoint junior colleagues to aid in their massive struggle to secure a bright future for the empire. After the meetings in Milan, Diocletian headed back to his de facto capital in Nicomedia, while Maximian remained in Italy. Where exactly Constantius was at this point is unknown, but he was somewhere in the west, either seeing to things in Gaul or staying in Milan with Maximian. The whereabouts of the fourth member of our eventual tetrarchy, though, is an even greater mystery. Though Galerius will soon emerge as a formidable force in Roman history, for example, in many ways he wound up being the unwitting author of Rome's Christianization, which is not a small thing at all, his life and career up to this point is shrouded in mist. He was born sometime between 250 and 260, and was probably slightly younger than Constantius, though not by much. Unlike the rest of his colleagues, Galerius also appears to have been born in Thrace, rather than one of the Illyrian provinces proper, and for a time he followed his father as a herdsman before deciding to join the army, most likely during the reign of Aurelian. He too no doubt established himself as a highly capable soldier, because in just a few years he went from new recruit to high-ranking officer, and like his future colleague Constantius, he was very possibly appointed Praetorian Prefect by the late 280s AD, serving under Diocletian in the east. But beyond this, we know almost nothing about how Galerius managed to distinguish himself from all the other viable candidates when it came time for Diocletian to expand the imperial college. But distinguish himself he did, and in the spring of 293 AD, after much consideration and with so many of the empire's long-term problems still unresolved, Diocletian made the move to name 2 more members of the imperial brotherhood and establish what we today refer to as the Tetrarchy. Though it is important to note that, like the first triumvirate, no one called it the Tetrarchy at the time. In simultaneous ceremonies in Sirmium and Milan, the 2 Augusti each formally elevated a colleague to serve alongside them, Maximian investing Constantius and Diocletian investing Galerius. To cement the imperial alliance, each new Caesar was married to the daughter of an Augustus, though the timing of these marriages is still a matter of debate. As I said, Constantius appears to have already been married to Theodora, which, if true, may have been the reason why he got the nod in the first place, and it is likely that Galerius too was already married to Diocletian's only daughter Valeria when he was elevated to power. Though this is all still up in the air, we know for sure that by 293, each man was the son-in-law of their respective Augusti. Now, as with Maximian's initial elevation, Constantius and Galerius were not made full Augusti, but were instead raised to the rank of Caesar. Though they would outrank every other man in the empire and would in their own territorial spheres have almost complete autonomy, they were most definitely styled as the junior partners in the equation. Maximian and Diocletian still outranked them, and by virtue of both his seniority and his overpowering gravitas, Diocletian outranked them all. The empire was then roughly divided in fourths, with Constantius taking Gaul and eventually Britain, Maximian in charge of Spain, Africa, and Italy, Galerius taking the Danube provinces, and Diocletian watching the Far East. The split in provinces reflected the relative seniority of the tetrarchs, with Diocletian and Maximian taking the rich and relatively peaceful portions of the empire, while their junior Caesars handled the much rougher regions along the Rhine and Danube frontier. Constantius in particular was given the toughest assignment of all, as it was made clear to him that his entire reason for being, and possibly the whole reason the new tetrarchy existed at all, was that Britain had to be retaken. And retaking Britain, now 7 years gone from Roman control, had proven to be an impossible task up to that point. So, yeah, good luck with that. Now, before we go on, I should note that these territorial divisions were in no way officially demarcated political units, and in fact, every chance he got, Diocletian emphasized the unity of the empire. He was sensitive to the fact that Rome had just gone through a traumatic decade and a half where the empire really was divided from itself, and he was not keen to reopen that still healing wound. So he established a precedent whereby each of the tetrarchs would share in the victories of the others, coin in each other's names, and come and go and shift spheres of influence as the situation dictated. As we'll see, Diocletian and Galerius in particular would flip-flop depending on where the empire's fires were burning brightest. Power was being shared by 4 men, and for obvious reasons, each established capitals, allowing them to easily manage a different zone. But the empire is still one empire. It is not, Diocletian went to great lengths to express, nor will it ever be, he repeated again and again, 4 separate empires. Following their respective elevations, the 2 new Caesars went to work right away. For Constantius, this meant heading north to Trier, where he immediately began to prepare a second invasion of Britain. Galerius, meanwhile, immediately put lie to the notion that the Tetrarchy's territorial divisions were hard and fast by heading to Egypt to help quell an uprising on the Upper Nile, and he spent most of the next 2 years pacifying the Egyptian natives. While he was engaged in Egypt, events in Sassanid Persia hinted at what Galerius's next assignment would be. In 293, the Persian king Bahram II died, leaving the throne to his young son Bahram III. But just a few months later, Bahram III would be deposed by another of Shapur's sons, a man named Narses, who despised his weak-willed brother and nephew and planned to reintroduce the martial vigor of Ardashir and Shapur. In 295, Narses broke the eternal peace that had been established with Rome in 287 by invading Armenia and seizing the territories that had been ceded by Bahram in his negotiations with Diocletian. Conflict between the two great empires was now inevitable, and Diocletian called Galerius to Antioch to begin preparations for war. Back in the West, meanwhile, Constantius faced the question that had basically broken Maximian. How do we retake Britain? Now, the new Caesar had some ideas as to how to run a better invasion than Maximian, and when it finally came time to take back the island, Constantius did run a much more strategically sound campaign. But the real problem, the big problem, was Carus himself. The self-proclaimed Augustus of Britain and Northern Gaul was no dummy, and he was no tyrant. By all accounts, he was a sound administrator, a savvy negotiator, a charismatic leader, and an excellent soldier. He was essentially everything that you would want in an emperor, and the citizens of his domains were highly conscious of that fact. The merchants loved him because he kept trade flourishing. His Frankish allies loved him because they were treated almost as equal partners. The legions loved him because he maintained high currency standards and was always on time with pay. And the general population loved him because he protected them from marauders and pirates. Carus, much like Postumus in the Gallic Empire, was a capable leader leading capably. There was no reason for anyone to wish him ill will. So when Constantius was working up his invasion plans then, he could pretty much bank on the fact that there wasn't going to be some fifth column working behind the lines for him. This was going to be an invasion of enemy territory in almost every sense of the word. And they had a better navy than he did, and their coastlines were fortified, and the British legions were well paid and well supplied. There was a reason Maximian had failed so completely, and it wasn't just that Maximian had screwed it all up. The recapture of Britain was a really, really hard assignment. Next week, we will see the empire at war on two fronts. In the east, Galerius will indeed be called upon to lead a counterattack against a resurgent Sassanid empire. And though in the end he will avenge the memory of Valerian, at first, like so many Roman wars, things did not go well at all. In the west, however, things will go a bit better, as Constantius will carefully and methodically isolate Carus by leading a brilliant little campaign against the Franks on the mainland. Then, he will be given the greatest gift of all, as Carus, like Postumus and Odenathus before him, will fall victim to an assassination plot that will leave Britain wide open for reconquest, and allow Constantius to style himself the restorer of eternal light. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode 124, The Tetrarchs at War. We left off last week with our two newly appointed junior emperors, Constantius and Galerius, ready to begin the wars they had been assigned by their senior colleagues. In the north, Constantius was making final preparations for his invasion of Britain, while in the east, Galerius outlined his strategy for a punitive expedition against the Sassanids, who had recently broken their treaty with Rome by invading Armenia. For the moment, it looked like Constantius had drawn the short straw, forced to fight fellow Romans in an attempt to retake a nearly impregnable island that had thus far proved to be an impossible nut to crack. Galerius, on the other hand, got to fight Persians, and in addition to the riches and glory that usually came with campaigns in the east, Galerius also stood to be the man who finally avenged the long unavenged capture of Valerian. Constantius's assignment was hard and unglamorous. Galerius's was, well, not easy, but certainly not as hard, and it was most likely going to prove 10 times as glamorous. But despite the relative difficulties of their respective wars, it would shortly be Constantius who was bathed in glory for reconquering the province of Britannia, and Galerius who was forced to walk a mile in front of Diocletian's litter as penance for the defeats he had suffered. To deal with the Western Front first, we must follow Constantius from Milan up to Trier, where he established a capital for his coming campaigns. As I mentioned last week, Constantius was probably involved at the highest level in the previous attempt to retake Britain, and so was acutely aware of what had gone wrong. Two big mistakes appear to have stuck out to him. First, despite the understanding that they needed to pacify the Germans before proceeding, they had not taken this to its logical conclusion. That is, they knocked out all the periphery tribes and established a launching pad from the Rhine Delta, but they had done nothing to directly attack Carausius's Frankish allies in northern Gaul. As long as Carausius controlled both sides of the English Channel, not only would his supply and trade lines remain open, and those trade lines were a part of the key to his legitimacy, but he would also be able to concentrate his defense forces on the eastern approach to Britain, since that would be the only direction an invasion fleet would be able to come from. So Constantius resolved to make his first objective dislodging the Franks from the Gallic coast. Once they were out of the way, he would be able to deal with the second big mistake, namely, that a single invasion force approaching from a direction the enemy expected was no way to break through a naval blockade. You have to at least be a little sneaky about these things, and so Constantius resolved to be a little more sneaky when it came time to put his own ships in the water. Taken together, these two corrections wound up winning the war for Constantius. The first fatally undermined Carausius's regime, the second completely paralyzed his successor. Right away, that is in late 293 AD, just months after being made Caesar, Constantius launched the first of his attacks in pursuit of Objective 1, neutralize the Franks. The key port on the Gallic coast controlled by the Franks was Boulogne, and so, not beating around the bush, Constantius laid siege to the city in the autumn of 293. The Frankish leaders felt pretty good about their ability to hold out. Constantius was in no position to threaten their access to the sea, and the approach by land was thin and heavily fortified. But Constantius was not here to mess around, and even though no one, probably not even his own men, expected it, the Caesar went right for the jugular and began to threaten the Franks' access to the sea. It's a little hard to describe, but in essence, Constantius had his men build a dam across the harbor, cutting off any possible sea traffic. Though he had no navy to speak of, Constantius was thus able to cut off the Frankish ships from their main port of call and leave the defenders of Boulogne stranded without the possibility of relief. It did not take long for them to recognize that their situation was hopeless and capitulate to Constantius's legions. The capture of Boulogne, while in and of itself a good thing, actually turned out to be a bigger boon to Constantius's chances of winning back Britain than even he could have predicted at the outset. Because the loss of access to the mainland caused by the fall of Boulogne dealt a major blow to Carausius's legitimacy and left him vulnerable to a murderous palace coup. I haven't been able to find a good answer to the question of what the conspirators thought they were going to accomplish by assassinating Carausius, but in the winter of 293, a cabal led by the British finance minister Electus killed the man who had been their Augustus these last 7 years. With Carausius out of the way, Boulogne remained lost, and the little British Empire was now deprived of its most able general. So, yeah, I'm not sure what they were hoping to accomplish. Sometimes, I guess, power is its own reward. Electus declared himself Augustus, and the noose was pulled a bit tighter. But the now practically inevitable execution of the British regime did not follow right away. The problem seems to have been that in the aftermath of Maximian's defeat, there was no concerted effort to rebuild the navy that had just been annihilated. So in the aftermath of his own victory at Boulogne some 4 years later, Constantius still had no navy. As with the reason for Carus's assassination, I haven't been able to find a good explanation for why a fleet was not being rebuilt, especially since everyone knew there was going to be a second invasion attempt. But if I had to speculate, I would say that no one really knew when or under what circumstances the next invasion would take place, so why waste time and resources constructing a fleet that might sit idle for years, and in the interim be sitting ducks for Frankish attacks that might see the new ships destroyed before they even had a chance to launch. But I'm just guessing. All we really know is that following the capture of Boulogne and the assassination of Carus, 2 years would pass before Constantius set sail to retake the island. In the meantime, he seems to have followed the same basic policy as Maximian and Diocletian and campaigned extensively against the Alemanni in order to ensure that the mainland would be pacified when he headed across the water. And, of course, he continued to campaign against the Franks until they had been brought completely to heel, culminating with the placement of a new pro-Roman king at the head of their confederation. By 295, though, things were all set. Maximian moved up from Milan to watch the Rhine frontier, and Constantius readied his fleets to sail. What's that? Fleets, you say? That's right. Taking advantage of his control of the Gallic coast, Constantius divided up his forces in two, launching them from 2 different ports with 2 different landing spots in mind, so as to divide the enemy and keep them guessing as to where the invasion was headed. Constantius himself launched from Boulogne on his way to Dover, while his Praetorian prefect, Asclepiodotus, launched from the mouth of the Seine River on his way to the Isle of Wight. Just as with Maximian's invasion, supposedly, the short trip to Britain was complicated by bad weather. But with 2 fleets on the water, instead of just 1, the operation was able to keep moving forward, rather than coming to a complete standstill when Constantius's ships were stalled out in the storm. Asclepiodotus's fleet was able to navigate the rough seas and make a landing somewhere near Southampton. Once ashore, the prefect burned his ships, not just to prevent their capture, but also to remind his men that there would be no retreat. Victory or death. That is what the gods had in store for them. Now, Electus, the self-proclaimed Augustus of Britain, who had been running the island for the last 2 years, was not a tenth of the soldier Carus had been. Believing Constantius was coming from the southeast, since that is where the previous invasion had come from, Electus had massed his forces down in Kent to meet what he thought would be a single invading army. When reports suddenly began arriving, detailing an invasion force marching north from Southampton, Electus panicked and pulled his forces up to block the road to London. But in his haste to get the army moving, they became disorganized and spread out, with the British legions proper divided from the Frankish mercenaries the British regime had been employing since Carus first established his independence. So the defense force Electus planted on the road to meet the advancing Romans was not at full strength, nor well organized, nor well led. Asclepiodotus did not have to work very hard to smash them to pieces, and Electus himself died in the fighting. When the weather cleared up, Constantius landed his forces and began his own march on London. With the news of Electus's defeat already circulating throughout the island, the arrival of Constantius suddenly had a whole new vibe. The Frankish mercenaries who had not fought and died were now viewed as a far greater threat than Constantius and his legions. The citizens of Britain were shutting up their homes and cities, not because they feared Constantius, but because they feared what the Franks would do now that they were off the leash. And their fear was well placed, as it appears that the Franks took Electus's defeat as their cue to sack as much of the countryside as they could. Constantius caught up with them before they reached London, though, and in a quick battle, annihilated the marauding Franks. When Constantius set sail, he had every reason to believe that the battle for London would be a hard-fought affair. But now, as he approached the capital, he found himself greeted not as an enemy, but as a beloved hero. This great and mighty Caesar had delivered Britain from the destructive wrath of the Franks. Just like that, the province of Britannia was reabsorbed, more than willingly at this point, into the empire. To celebrate this victory, Constantius began issuing coins with his own face, bearing the legend, Restorer of Eternal Light. Just as Constantius was celebrating his victory in the west, Galerius was beginning his campaign in the east. After spending most of the last 2 years in Egypt, the Caesar had been brought north to Antioch to confer with Diocletian and figure out what to do about the resurgent Sassanids. Diocletian had been watching with alarm as the new Persian king Narses adopted an increasingly hostile posture towards Rome. At first, this new posture manifested itself in relatively harmless displays of strength by the Persians along their western frontier. But lately, Narses had been making troubling alliances with the tribes and petty kingdoms of the borderland. Then, in either 295 or 296, the Persian king moved out of the theatrical and into the martial by invading Armenia, defeating and deposing the pro-Roman king Tiridates in the process. From Armenia, Narses moved his forces south through Osroene and stood poised now on the Syrian border. Diocletian knew that Narses was self-consciously styling himself as the new Shapur, and it was entirely likely that the Persian king was getting ready to invade Syria and sack Antioch, just as Shapur had done. Diocletian was unwilling to wait for the other shoe to drop, and so in mid-296, Galerius marched out at the head of an army to confront the Persians before they decided to cross into Roman territory. The two armies met near Carus, a site of Crassus's great defeat some 3 centuries before, and after wasting precious little time on diplomatic niceties, the Romans and Sassanids threw themselves at one another. The result was an unmitigated disaster for Rome. Narses ran his heavy cavalry and archery detachments in perfect tandem, and this Persian 1-2 punch caught the Romans completely flat-footed. After suffering extensive losses, Galerius was able to extract what was left of his army and lead them on a limping march back to Antioch. Legend has it that upon his arrival, Galerius was met outside the city by a furious Diocletian, who made the defeated Caesar walk a mile on foot in front of Diocletian's imperial litter as punishment for his failure. It is likely that this episode is a colorful invention, but there is no doubt that in the aftermath of the defeat, Diocletian made Galerius take full responsibility for the episode. Such was the cost of maintaining the Tetrarchy's stability. Victories would be shared by all 4 men equally, but defeats would be the responsibility of the losing general alone. That being said, in all likelihood, Diocletian's public shaming of Galerius is a later invention. For one thing, no contemporary source mentions the incident, but perhaps more importantly, it would not at all have been in keeping with Diocletian's character. The senior Augustus was careful to cultivate a public image of the imperial college as one of unwavering mutual support and unity of purpose, as was so demonstrated in the aftermath of Maximian's failed British invasion. To humiliate Galerius out in the open like that would not just have poked holes in that public image, but it likely would have done real damage to the actual unity Diocletian was trying to maintain behind the scenes. Eradicating the conditions that led to the rampant civil wars of the crisis years was one of Diocletian's biggest concerns, and I highly doubt that he would have so carelessly undermined all of his efforts by slapping his junior colleague around in public. Honor was a huge part of what made these men tick, and humiliating Galerius so brazenly might have ticked the Caesar off to the point that he would have viewed overthrowing Diocletian as a reasonable response. So, while I have no trouble believing that Diocletian bawled Galerius out in private, in public, I can't imagine he would have done anything to risk imperial unity, especially for something as petty as making a guy walk in front of your horse for a little while. But it was not all bad for the Romans. Despite the fact that he had been bested in the field, Galerius had obviously put up enough of a fight that the Persian king, whatever his intentions had been before, did not immediately follow up his victory with an invasion of Syria. And it's a good thing that he didn't, because just a few months after the defeat of Galerius, word came up from Egypt that yet another revolt had broken out. The origins of this latest unrest will be dealt with more fully a few episodes down the road when I dive into Diocletian's economic reforms. So just know for now that Diocletian's crackdown on tax evasion did not at all go over well with the perpetually tax-evading Egyptians. Leaving Galerius in Syria to oversee the rebuilding of the frontier defenses, Diocletian decided to personally see to the problem of Egypt. In 297, what had begun as a series of local uprisings had coalesced into a province-wide movement that even had its own self-proclaimed Augustus, a man named Lucius Domitius Domitianus, who was attempting to reassert all the special privileges Egypt, and in particular Alexandria, had always enjoyed, and that Diocletian was now trying to take away. Diocletian, though, had a vision for the future of the empire, and special treatment for special people was not at all a part of that vision. Just ask the citizens of Italy, who, at that same time, were having all of their long-held privileges revoked one by one. Pay taxes? You've got to be joking. But like I say, we'll get into all that later. So Diocletian came down to Egypt, and despite stiff resistance from the natives, he thoroughly smacked down the rebellion with an iron hand. The emperor had no intention of allowing Egypt to become the bleeding ulcer that Britain had been for so long, and mercy towards the rebels was in short supply. There is even a charming little story about how, when he finally took Alexandria after a surprisingly difficult 9-month siege, the enraged Diocletian announced that he was going to slaughter everyone in the city until the blood ran up to his horse's knee. Then, as if on cue, the tired horse decided at that very moment to kneel down, knees, of course, now touching the ground. Diocletian took the hint the gods sent him and ordered a stop to the massacre he was intending to unleash on the Alexandrians. This little story is even more charming because in gratitude, the Alexandrians allegedly built a statue in honor of Diocletian's horse once the emperor had moved on. By the end of 297, though, the revolt was nipped in the bud, Domitianus was dead, and the emperor could turn his attention back to the Persian problem. Back up in Antioch, Galerius had spent the year successfully rebuilding the Syrian legions, and when Diocletian arrived, the senior Augustus was pleased to discover that his junior colleague was ready to go back on the offensive. And it was the offensive they would have to go back on, because, despite his initially bold moves, King Narses had learned that the Romans were not the pushover he had perhaps led himself to believe they were. He didn't give up his position in Armenia or Mesopotamia, but he also didn't press on any further. When it became obvious that the Persian king was not going to invade and press his luck inside Roman territory, the emperors decided to take the fight to him again. As we've seen over and over again, the Romans never took a defeat as the last word in anything, and it was in fact almost axiomatic that the last word had to be a Roman victory. If the Romans lost, it was only a setback on the road to final victory. It could not possibly mean an end to hostilities, because the only time the Romans allowed an end to hostilities was when the Romans won. They were simply a maddening opponent that way. So in 298 AD, Galerius marched out at the head of an army to track down Narses and bring an end to hostilities. This time, the Caesar played it a bit smarter. Rather than heading straight for the Persian army, which was then encamped on the plains of Mesopotamia, he decided to take the road in through the mountains of Armenia and force Narses to fight on ground that Galerius hoped would neutralize the Persian heavy cavalry advantage. Narses took the bait, and this time, when the two armies met, the legions routed the Sassanids, though the battle was not at all decisive. Narses retreated, and Galerius pursued, hoping to catch the Persians before they re-established themselves on better ground. Luckily, the Persian withdrawal was haphazard, and with the help of local guides, Galerius was able to close the distance between the two armies and launch an attack on the utterly surprised Sassanids when they were still in their camp one night. This time, the battle was decisive. Not only was the Sassanid army cut to pieces, but Narses was forced to flee for his life without being able to stop and collect his wives, his harem, or his royal treasury, all of which fell into the hand of the triumphant Galerius. The Sassanid military was now broken. The king was now running for his life, and valuable hostages had now been seized. Now hostilities could end. Well, not quite yet. Galerius took a victory lap down through Mesopotamia in order to sack the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, which at this point was practically a rite of passage for Roman generals serving in the east. Unchecked, Galerius probably would have marched all the way to India, but he was stopped by Diocletian, who was able to see the bigger picture. Diocletian had no desire to rule over Persia. He just wanted peace with the Sassanids on the best possible terms, and with the king's wives and harem being treated with the utmost respect by their Roman captors, Diocletian was now in a position to leverage an even better deal than he had worked out with Bahram in 287. And leverage a better deal he did. A summit was arranged between the Roman emperors and Persian ambassadors at Nispus in 299, where Diocletian laid out his terms. After an amusing but likely fictitious exchange that saw the Persian envoys attempt to lecture the Romans on the importance of being magnanimous in defeat, and Galerius then practically blowing a blood vessel, demanding to know where the Persians got off lecturing the Romans about magnanimity when the stuffed corpse of Valerian was still being held as a Sassanid trophy. After this, the Persian envoys agreed to all the Roman terms. Not only was Armenia brought back into the Roman fold, but for the first time, the kingdoms of the Caucasus Mountains were made Roman clients, and cities on the east side of the Tigris were ceded to Roman control. In every way, Diocletian got the better of the Persians in the Peace of Nispus, and the capture of the Persian royal family was understood to balance the scales for the capture of Valerian. All of which was nice, but what was even nicer was that the peace brokered in 299 would last for the next 40 years, and that was a victory for everyone. So it was that at the close of the 3rd century, a century defined by the empire's near collapse, Rome was as strong as ever. 15 years of political stability overseen by one of the best leaders the empire had ever seen. Internal revolts squelched, external threats neutralized, and a socio-economic order redesigned to match with the realities of this new age. Rome would never again be allowed the kind of freedom of movement it had enjoyed during its various golden ages, and it would indeed be a constant daily struggle just to maintain what Diocletian had established. But something had been established. In the next few weeks, we are going to investigate what exactly had been established, starting next time with an analysis of Rome's new military posture. After that, we'll deal with Diocletian's economic reforms, including his famous edict on prices, and then cover his reorganization of the governmental apparatus. Taken together, Diocletian transformed just about every aspect of Roman life. But again, as I mentioned before, he was not trying to create a new world order. He was trying to save the old world order. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 125, The Best Defense is a Good Defense. Over the centuries, the Roman legions had been transformed and then retransformed anytime the old way of getting things done stopped getting things done. The Romans loved their traditions, but they never for a second allowed sentimentality to get in the way of always having the best strategic and tactical military operation in the world. For years, Rome was just another city-state, fielding small armies composed of farmer soldiers who fought using the traditional Greek phalanx. When the phalanx proved unworkable in the hills of Samnium, the Romans adapted the legions into the famous three-line maniple system that they then used to conquer most of the Mediterranean. Then Marius came along and revolutionized not just how the Romans fought, but who was doing the fighting, ushering out the age of the temporary conscript army and ushering in the age of the professional standing army. This, of course, wound up having the unintended side effect of also revolutionizing who these new standing armies fought, because for practically the whole of the next century, the enemy the Roman legions fought more than any other was other Roman legions. Following the triumph of Augustus, the mission of the legions changed again. No longer was their primary objective to conquer foreign lands, but instead it became to protect the lands that had already been conquered. Legionary garrisons were posted on the frontiers to monitor the borders, and that is where they basically stayed for the next 3 centuries. Domitian and Hadrian cemented this mission in the late 1st century and early 2nd centuries AD by literally building walls to demarcate the empire from the barbarian lands beyond. You'll recall from earlier, though, that these walls were not designed to act as insurmountable fortifications, but rather were erected to control the flow of traffic and serve as a stable line from which the legions could mount forward operations and smother potential threats before they actually reached the empire. The utility of these lines, though, was premised on the notion that the Romans would always have superiority of numbers in the local theaters of operation. As long as the tribes along the Danube or the Rhine or up in Britain were divided from one another, one random chief getting it in his head to cause trouble was no big deal. Send in a legion, smack them around, be home by dinner. But by the late 2nd century, this assumption of numerical superiority became a dangerous fallacy. The tribes were beginning to join forces, something Marcus Aurelius learned full well during the Marcomannic Wars. As the 2nd century gave way to the 3rd century, this evolution of the Germanic tribes from disparate groups into larger confederations only sped up, and for most of the next century, as we saw ad nauseum in the last 15 episodes or so, the local legions stopped being a match for the invasion forces that now vastly outnumbered them. The legions and the provinces they protected were overrun, and only through immense effort and more than a little luck was the empire eventually able to turn the invaders back. For almost the entirety of the 3rd century, this shift in the balance of power forced the Romans to play catch-up, always 1, 2, or even 3 steps behind their enemies. A combination of improvised new strategies, think Gallienus's mobile cavalry, and sheer force of will, think Aurelian, allowed Rome to emerge intact into the late 3rd century. But it was clear that one of these days they were going to have to completely reassess their military posture. With the ascension of Diocletian, that day finally came. Not only did the new emperor possess the intellectual heft to conceive of something more than just another run of ad hoc responses, but when he came to power in the mid-280s AD, the empire had gotten just enough breathing space that it was open to change. In the north, the tribes of the Rhine and the Danube, and especially the Goths, who had been such a destructive force, had been beaten back by Diocletian's predecessors, and in the east, the Sassanids were temporarily weak and divided following the death of Shapur. The time to act was now, and Diocletian did not miss his opportunity. So, what did he do? Broadly speaking, there are 4 things I want to talk about today. First, Diocletian's administrative redistricting that created a ring of small militarized provinces around the edge of the empire. Second, the final separation of military and civilian career paths. Third, the division of the army into two distinct forces, the legions proper and a new static frontier militia. And finally, how these reforms interacted to create a web of varying depth surrounding the empire that would ensnare and then destroy an invading enemy. This is the so-called defense in depth theory proposed by Edward Lutwyck, and we will talk both about the model he proposed as well as the critiques other scholars have levied against it. Now, before we go on, I should note that all the usual caveats about a lack of good sources for all of this stuff still applies, and that as historians and scholars have cobbled together a picture of Diocletian's military, that they have been forced to rely on historians writing decades and even centuries after the fact. It is, in short, difficult to separate out things that were specifically initiated by Diocletian from things that were merely attributed to him. Difficult to separate out things that were centrally planned from things that were initiated on the local level. And finally, difficult to weed out descriptions of his armies that are 100% free of anachronisms. That being said, the composition and posture of the legions did change during the period of the Tetrarchy, and the items I just outlined represent a fairly conservative estimation of the changes Diocletian undertook. Back in episode 89, Provincial Matters, we took a 45-minute-long tour of the empire that touched on each and every province in existence at the height of Rome's fame and fortune. That tour is now officially obsolete. In the mid-290s AD, most likely right as the Tetrarchy was being formed, Diocletian initiated a redistricting of the empire on a massive scale. At its most basic level, Diocletian waved his imperial wand and doubled the number of provinces overnight. We will deal more with the administrative implications of his redistricting next week, though, no, we will not be going on a tour of the now 100-odd Roman provinces. And for now, I want to focus solely on the military implications of the new boundary lines. Diocletian undertook the redrawing of the provincial lines for two main military reasons. First and foremost, by fracturing the size of the provinces, Diocletian hoped to cut down on the amount of power a single commander would wield. No more governor of Britain controlling 3 legions by himself, or the governor of Lower Germany personally commanding 3 or 4 of his own. Smaller provinces meant a local commander would usually have at his disposal what amounted to a single legion. This hopefully meant less threat of revolt. And the second reason the provinces were fractured is that Diocletian wanted to divide up the dangerous and perpetually besieged outer rim of the empire from the softer and more prosperous inner territories. The former would become essentially military districts, while the latter would be allowed to go back to being simply provinces, or, more accurately, undistracted economic engines for the empire. In essence, Diocletian wanted the ministers in charge of the outer provinces to focus on defense, and the ministers of the inner provinces to focus on the economy. These two factors had to work in tandem for the empire to thrive, and the emperor no longer wanted economic concerns to go unaddressed because the governor was off fighting the Alemanni, and he didn't want the frontier lines to be neglected because the governor of Pannonia was stuck dealing with a grain distribution issue. Related to the division of the empire into what amounted to military and civilian districts was the final severing of military and civilian career paths. This was not a novel idea by any means, but Diocletian brought it to its logical conclusion. Since the reign of Gallienus, the Senate had been denied military postings, which meant, in practice, that key provincial governorships were now handed over to military men, rather than rich aristocrats, as had been the previous custom. But this was not enough for Diocletian. In his mind, it was just as bad for career soldiers to be running administrative offices as it was for untrained senators to be leading armies. It was an inefficient misallocation of talent, and he aimed to put a stop to it. So, flying in the face of the whole of Roman history, Diocletian decreed that the political governor of a province and its chief military officer would no longer be the same man. He did this for the same basic reason he divided up the provinces. First, the checks and balances created by the separation of military and political power would undercut potential rebellion. And second, it would allow each leader to focus on his appointed tasks without being suddenly called off to deal with a foreign invasion or a new tax law. Of course, political and military power could never be divorced from one another at the highest level. But from here on out, on the provincial level, a general, now called a dux, the precursor of the medieval duke, was not in charge of tax collection, and the governor was not in charge of any troops. Together with the creation of the militarized Outer Rim provinces, the split of defense concerns from political or economic concerns meant that the army would no longer be distracted in any way from their all-important task of keeping the empire safe from attack. The question then is, what did Diocletian's army look like, and how did it differ from the army he inherited? Well, we've already seen that right off the bat he was troubled by the concentration of force around the emperor, and how that left huge swaths of the empire open to attack. That was the main catalyst behind his initial decision to elevate Maximian, and it played a huge part in his further decision to create the Tetrarchy. A sole emperor running around trying to plug every leak in the empire was as dangerous as it was impractical. No matter how fast it could move, it would never be fast enough. So right away, we see the armies return to something resembling their pre-crisis years deployments. Only now, each section of the empire was not commanded by a potential usurper, but a fully initiated member of the imperial brotherhood. But wait a second. Didn't that old system completely break down in the face of immense new pressures? Why, yes it did. But we should not forget that a big reason why it broke down was that usurpers kept leaving the frontiers undefended as they made their bids for power back in Italy. The establishment of the Tetrarchy was supposed to negate that possibility, and at least while Diocletian reigned, that's exactly how it worked. But of course, usurpers abandoning their post was not the whole story, and Diocletian knew it. The other big problem was that the old legionary deployments neither spread the Roman forces out enough to effectively monitor the frontier, nor concentrated enough force in one area for them to overwhelm their new, larger opponents. In other words, the 4,800 to 6,000 man Roman legion, which had been in existence for 800-odd years, was now becoming obsolete. Previous emperors had, of course, realized this already. Gallienus's creation of the mobile cavalry is an obvious result of this understanding. But Diocletian's reformed legionary formations would actually flow from a different tradition. For years, cohorts of soldiers, usually labeled vexellations, would be peeled off from their parent legion and deployed elsewhere to shore up some undermanned area or lend a hand in some difficult situation. Sometimes the vexellations would return home when their specific task was complete, but often they simply never returned to their parent legion at all. In many theaters, these vexellations, usually numbering between 500 and 1,000 men, began to be regarded as the de facto unit of deployment. Smaller and faster than a standard legion, they could be bunched together when a concentration of forces was needed, and kept spread apart when the danger had passed and frontier-wide surveillance was needed. Diocletian knew all about how these vexillation units functioned, and how much flexibility they gave commanders, and when he took power, he aimed to make their status official. That did not mean that the old legions were simply scrapped, and indeed most of the existing legions kept right on functioning as they always had. But it did mean that when Diocletian created new legions, as the circumstances of his times demanded that he do, they were not the traditional size. Diocletian's legions were instead a complement of just 1,000 men, which helps explain how he was able to add 30 new legions to the rolls over the course of his reign, which would be a staggering number if you fail to account for their reduced size. These new legions were stationed across the empire at strategic points, far enough apart that they could watch a wide swath of territory, while simultaneously being close enough to one another that if a major invasion broke across the frontier, they could quickly join together and fend off the attack. We'll get into a deeper discussion of that in a minute. The other real innovation that Diocletian introduced into the army is a little bit trickier to nail down, because it involves the possible insertion of anachronisms into the historical record. The traditional account is that it is at this point that the legions were joined on the frontiers by a less well-trained, less well-paid quasi-militia called, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Limitanii. These troops, drawn from the local population, would be part-time soldiers and part-time farmers, and thus, in addition to helping defend the empire, they would also help keep the heavily garrisoned frontier provinces at least somewhat self-sufficient. Their mission was twofold. First, to police the frontier lines and defend against small-time brigands, and second, to act as a warning bell for the rest of the army if something bigger was on the way. No one expected the Limitanii to stop anything of substance coming across the border, but they were expected to raise the alarm and hold key fortifications until help arrived. The problem with all of this is that though Diocletian usually gets credit for introducing the Limitanii into the system, these militiamen really aren't fully documented until Constantine's reign, leading some to suspect that later historians mislabeled Diocletian's frontier deployments using a vocabulary that had not been invented yet. We have a good idea that small detachments were posted along the frontiers, but the debate over whether these troops represented the same type of Limitanii forces that Constantine used is still a matter of much debate. What is a matter of less debate is how much all of this increased the overall size of the army. Again, we are working from sources that are further removed from Diocletian's own time as we'd like, but the consensus seems to be that all told, Diocletian took an army roughly 350,000 strong and cranked it up to about 500,000 by the time he retired. He pulled this off by ordering his agents to engage in some pretty heavy-handed recruitment efforts, which is to say, they didn't linger too long on persuasion before moving right on into conscription. And of course, if you're wondering what the effect this vast increase the size of the military had on the overall economy, as the Romans were essentially transferring 150,000 young men from productive farm labor to non-productive soldiering, well, the answer is that the economy took a pretty substantial hit. A hit we'll get into in more detail in 2 weeks when we look at Diocletian's economic policies. The other matter that is still hotly debated today is how all of this fit together. Back in 1976, Edward Lutwyck advanced a fairly comprehensive theory of what he called defense in depth. What he argued is that Diocletian essentially gave up trying to defend a static line in the sand and opted instead to weave a web of defense that an enemy could enter at will, but then only make it so far into before becoming permanently entangled. The key to this defense in-depth strategy was something that we've talked about earlier, but that I haven't mentioned so far today because it wasn't really one of Diocletian's overt reforms. Namely, the intense effort the Romans undertook to build strong defensive walls around every city, town, and granary in sight. These fortified positions became key hinge points for the new defensive strategy and the reason why the whole system was able to function as conceived. The way it worked was this. Out on the front line, the Limitanii forces would keep an eye on things from a series of small forts connected by a military road. A little bit behind them would be stationed fewer but larger contingents of cavalry, and a little bit behind them would be one or two main legionary garrisons. A large invasion force would then be able to easily blow past the Limitanii, but that was okay, because they could take refuge in their well-supplied, easily defended forts. Then, the invasion force had two options. If the invading army chose to use the Roman roads for easy travel, they would pretty soon hit one of the larger fortified camps, and be forced to choose between besieging it, which would cost them time and resources, or they could bypass it, leaving themselves open to attack from the rear. If, on the other hand, they abandoned the road completely to avoid either of these scenarios, their pace would then be slowed considerably, usually preventing them from making it very much further before they were met by the Roman response. In any event, the enemy would find no easy access to provisions, since the Romans would have all of those locked up behind the walls of their forts, and quickly either retreat out of frustration, or stick around long enough for every Roman soldier in the region to collapse on them simultaneously from all sides. Thus, would the invaders be repelled quickly and efficiently. Now, is this really the way things worked? The answer is we have no idea. Some archaeological evidence, particularly in the East, seems to support Lutwik's theory, while the rest seems either inconclusive or downright hostile to the notion of a centrally planned defensive web surrounding the empire. Plus, it has been argued persuasively that whatever else you can say about the Romans, you can never say that they just wanted to sit back and wait for attack. True, during the crisis years, they were constantly sprinting from this invasion to that, but except for that period, the Romans always wanted to take the fight into enemy territory, and it would have been anathema to their most basic ideologies of warfare to design a system that was premised on a defensive posture. We have ourselves just gone through campaigns on the far side of the Rhine by Diocletian and Maximian, and on the far side of the Tigris by Galerius, both undertaken to preempt possible invasion into the empire. In neither of those cases were the emperors willing to just sit back and catch the enemy in a web. Debate still rages about what exactly Diocletian's overall strategy was, and indeed whether or not he even had an overall strategy, or whether this was all just randomly hashed out at the local level. But during his reign, we do seem to see wider and deeper force deployment patterns, an increase in the total number of troops, and a concerted effort to create a militarized ring around the empire, all of which suggests that he did have some kind of long-term defensive strategy in mind for the empire. Unfortunately, as with so much of Diocletian's work, the coming civil wars of the Tetrarchy, civil wars Diocletian had tried so hard to prevent, would wind up overwhelming many of his reforms to the military structure, as Rome once again fell back into the familiar pattern of waging eternal war on itself. What we can say for sure, though, is that Diocletian helped the empire transition its military from its classical configuration into the force that would be familiar to students of late antiquity, a force that in time set the stage for the armies that would be familiar to students of the Middle Ages. Rome is already practically running its military out of castles, so can King Arthur really be that far behind? Next week, we will get into one of the other ways that Diocletian set the stage for the next 1,000 years of history by discussing his reorganization of the imperial governmental apparatus. I'll talk more about his reordering of the provinces and some of the non-military aspects of the shift, as well as introduce a new term that we should all be familiar with today, the diocese, those overarching administrative zones that were taken over by the clergy as the empire in the West was falling apart, and whose borders, in many cases, have remained unchanged down to the present day. One last thing I'll mention before we go is that as of today, there are still 7 spots available for the final tour we have scheduled, which runs from May 28 to June 7, 2011. So if you thought you had missed out, or maybe you've been sitting on the fence about coming, by all means, drop by historyofrometour.com, check it out, and sign up. It's going to be really, really fun.